Hello, welcome to my talk on Neptune, and I'm grateful to be participating in another wonderful EA Zoom meeting with Linda. So thank Linda for having me, and I'm excited to talk about Neptune. I I don't see a lot of talking about Neptune in general in the astrology community. It seems to get left out of a lot of conversations, and I'll say even for myself, when I'm looking at somebody's chart, I tend to have the hardest time finding Neptune in the chart. For some reason, I just can never find that glyph. And so it's just, Neptune is always, it has such an elusive quality to it. And it can be really hard to really dig into. So for me, having this be an undertaking was kind of a little daunting, but fun. And ultimately I'm feel like I've gotten a lot out of doing this deep dive, and I'm excited to share with everybody. So let's get into it. So Neptune, yin, mutable, and water. It's god of the sea, ruler of Pisces, and I actually have Neptune, god of the sea, with me. I brought him along with my talk for good luck. He sits on my shelf usually. And is a planet of inspiration, dreams, psychic receptivity, subtlety, intuition, and spiritual enlightenment. Mercy and compassion, disillusionment, innocence, subconscious, unity consciousness, and transcendence. So when blocked, Neptune's energies create an illusion and confusion, sometimes naivete, as well as deception, trickery, deceit, guilt, and addiction. And that last part, I don't talk a lot about in this talk, but I wanted to clarify the aspect of addiction that plays into Pisces and Neptune is that desire to connect with something bigger, wanting to feel more of that that feeling of unity. And sometimes drugs are a way that people who are needing and craving connection so desperately, they might turn to drugs. And when they get that sense, that feeling of connection through that, then they start, rather than cultivating that within, they might sometimes get addicted to seeking it there. So I'll just leave that there. So first, I wanted to give a quick refresher on why I'm calling this my Birthing Consciousness series. Once I get into this, I don't reference this a lot, but this is something that was coming up for me a lot in the beginning when I first started really doing this deeper dive into the maximizing the energies and archetypes of these planets. There was something that, a piece of this that was really feeling like it wanted to make itself known to me, and so I wanted to pass that on to share. And that is that the soul is on a journey toward expressing itself on earth and in form. As a soul does not easily acclimate to the densities and karmas of this earth when arriving in its purest essence, the soul can adopt an ego to act, or it does adopt an ego to act as a surrogate self or a lowercase self. So the difference being between the uppercase S self and the lowercase s self, the ego being the lowercase s, the higher self being the uppercase S. So the ego is made up of karmic and social environmental conditionings, as well as styles of expression. This process is a mix of painful and playful as we play with the function of being creators, for better or worse. This ego as a container for self acts also as a surrogate womb in a way. It slows down the birthing process. So as our soul is incarnating here, being born all at once is a little bit too intense. It's too much to acclimate to the lower densities of the planet. So by the process of putting on these layers that create the womb, this womb creates a shell. You see this represented in Cancer with the moon, with the crab. So that ego being like a shell for us. Also, moon in Cancer being the womb. So this slows down the birthing process of our fullest light of our higher selves here on earth. As each layer of surrogate self is shed, that much more of our higher selves are birthed. inhabiting our bodies more fully and in greater consciousness. So within the archetype of every sign or planet in the chart, there is a self-expression and a self-expression. So that's self-expression, capital S, and a self-expression, lowercase s. So the difference in how the archetypes of these planets are being expressed comes down to this. When the energy of a planet or sign are being expressed from their most positive aspects, their energies are aligned with self, capital S. When their energies are in any way being impeded or blocked, resulting in a negative or misaligned version of the archetype, what is blocking their highest and noblest expression are actually the layers of karma or ego that we have adopted as a soul. So another way to say this is that without blocks, the full light of a planet's energy is expressed through the full light of our own consciousness. When we have blocks, by way of karmas or false identities, we block or filter the light of that planet, resulting in a shadow expression. So much the same way as anyone who's into Jungian psychology would look at the shadow self. When you're experiencing the shadow, when you're experiencing planets and the archetypes of the planets through the shadow self, you have a different experience. So this is why we might have a negative association with the archetypes, though the archetypes themselves are inherently neutral. In every archetypal energy within astrology, we can find our way toward alignment and conscious expression by noticing where we are experiencing the shadow side of an archetype. In this way, the chart is a map toward expressing the higher self, capital S, and, quote, birthing consciousness in the process. So there are some planets and signs, or to simply the archetypes in astrology, in the chart that are more directly push us in this direction. So Scorpio and Pluto, for example, pushes us to transform ourselves by always forcing us to dig deeper and keeping us engaged in the deeper soul work, which transmutes our karmas and better aligns us with the deeper desire for expression and understanding that was beneath all the forming of those karmas to begin with. So Sagittarius and Jupiter pushes us to consider the bigger picture, rising above whatever limited thinking we may have adopted. Aquarius and Neptune wants us to be authentic and spend less time, or sorry, I put Aquarius and Neptune, I meant to say Aquarius and Uranus, wants us to be authentic and spend less time in spaces that don't support our most unique expressions. So looking for a like-minded community where our true nature is best expressed. And then finally, Pisces and Neptune take all of our egoic personas and surrenders them back to source. It's a sign of letting go of all these limiters and blocks we have placed on ourselves and getting outside of our perspective in order to connect to that which is beyond self, yet does not exclude self. So whereas we have been learning to fully and consciously inhabit form up to this point, through that birthing consciousness, bringing the full light of our soul into this planet and into form. In Pisces, we find where we are integrated within the cosmic, more than form. In order to surrender to such a position, we do not need to give up our individuated self or our personal archetype, that which is unique to our essence. We only need to allow it to be one with source and all that is, where all is included. It is the expression of yes and versus yeah but. So it is where we rise above duality and allow ourselves to be fully inclusive within unity consciousness. So Neptune and glyph. And I really love looking at the meanings of the symbols. The symbols are just a really powerful way that these energies speak to us. The semicircle at the top of the glyph represents the soul, and the cross underneath is matter. In Neptune's glyph, the soul is above matter, yet matter intersects through the soul, lifting it up. At this stage of a chart, an individuated soul has mastered matter and risen above it in order to transcend and connect to higher dimensions. But mind that the soul at this full stage of mastery includes its mastery of matter, as Neptune and Pisces connect to all that is, which includes matter. The lesson of Pisces is not to detach from the material realm, but to include spirit and that which is formless into the totality of the soul on earth and beyond. So I feel like this is a really important lesson with Neptune because, as we'll get into later, there is sometimes a strong tendency with Neptune to do what is usually referred to as spiritual bypassing. So with spiritual bypassing, it's a way of not really having to deal with or cope with real world things, because you just say maybe like, oh, it's all God anyway, or oh yeah, but from a higher perspective, this doesn't really matter. And so it's just kind of a way of checking out. Neptune is a planet in Pisces 12th house. This is all an archetype that can be really notorious for checking out, and that's what you don't want. Presumably, as the soul has gone through all of the energies of the houses and signs from 1 to 12, by the time it gets to 12, having fully individuated itself as a soul, it's then ready to be that and more. It can hold that fully, be present, be in the moment, be here now, so to speak, while also connecting to something greater that is instead of escaping into it. So Pisces, Neptune in the 12th house can be hard and can create confusion when the ego, which is all about rigid identifications and labels, meets with the boundaryless nature of the archetype. So when one is not able to shed certain dualistic expressions based on the relativity of this versus that, me versus you, and so on, a soul will encounter the shadow side of the archetype. So illusion and confusion, naivete, deception, guilt. In some ways, a soul will not be able to differentiate what is theirs to hold and nurture for themselves versus what is another's, which causes confusion. They may, and that just comes from the boundarylessness, in the everythingness and the all that is that you connect to through Pisces, through Neptune. There's you sense more of what's around you. There's a merging quality with the all, and so then it gets to be hard to differentiate. Okay, where are my boundaries here? So they may get lost in the lack of boundaries and allow themselves to be taken advantage of. Naivete. They may lose track of what it is that they stand for in this space. And it can be hard to continue to stand for things when you're immersed in the everythingness. Suddenly there's this ability to really see so many perspectives. And then it's a matter of orienting back to like, yes, but me as an individuated soul, as my own individuated personal archetype, I have a perspective in this too. Like, you don't want to lose yourself. So one way to understand how this happens is to recognize that this space is not the mind's domain. The mind mostly functions in relative terms. It wants to understand relative to what it believes it already knows. It wants to define. In Pisces, there is more than what the mind has previously grasped. And Pisces is a place beyond definition. And so this instinct of the mind only leads to more duality rather than being resonant with the unity consciousness of Pisces. When Pisces connects us to that which is beyond what we already consciously understand, the invitation is to open to higher realms of experience. As we experience new insights and new connection within these higher realms, the mind immediately again jumps to synthesize this new information, and again, it tries to do so relative to what it already knows or thinks, immediately creating limiters. So this is also why meditation is so powerful. Meditation helps to connect to that Piscean place. The Pisces represents monks. It represents like nuns, meditation, spiritual practices that require you to really get outside of the mind and transcend those limitations, so that you can access more than what you've already calculated for yourself. It's through this tendency of the mind that we assign false meanings to what we encounter there, which leads to illusion and confusion. Again, so The solution to this is to take great care in how we synthesize that what we gain in this space. We may gain insight from this space from an intuitive or psychic capacity, and we may gain insight and experience from within the dream realm. So either way, we must be careful to not process it from the perspective of the ego or the mind. When our ego, for example, gets a hold of such larger than life experiences and expressions, it tends to become grandiose or make it about itself, which is all the ego knows to do. So making about itself keeps the insights from integrating fully and accurately, and it can create quite a detour as well as a delusion. Also, the mind tends to be in a hurry to explain these insights and moves quickly into relativity and away from unity. So it is very valuable practice to avoid mental chatter or self-talk around such insights, and instead stay in a listening space and allow the insights to seep in more deeply through receiving and into a place of knowing. So this the difference between thinking and knowing. Knowing is a feeling. You don't have to think your way into it. Sometimes you can just receive. So this takes patience, trust, and faith to not grasp for meaning and only receive understanding. So the full extent of understanding may take time to integrate, weeks, even years, but grasping for meaning and mentally processing surely stunts and severely limits this process. Something else that might be helpful to understand what that means, the understanding versus versus like grasping for meaning. So the way that I think of it is when you've received some kind of knowing, it's like when you just received the punchline to a joke. You didn't have to use words in your head to explain the joke to yourself in order to know that you got the punchline. You don't have to explain the punchline to yourself. It's just that there was some outer stimuli, in this case, the joke teller, and then in your part, there was this instant like, oh, I got it. But when we try to grasp for meaning, when there's something that we've already received in that way, and it's like that moment after someone just told you something, there is this moment that some kind of a knowing clicks. So when we're able to stay in that space, we have a different experience with the knowledge. It lands differently. So conversely, when you have a planet in Pisces or aspecting Neptune, its energies are sometimes inviting you toward disillusioning yourself around whatever that planet is representing to you, and it calls us away from dualistic expression. This is not always the case, but you might see that there's a planet in a strong aspect to Neptune or in the 12th house that has you have, in order to get to the true expression of the archetype, you have to work through a lot of illusions you have around that planet. There's this disillusioning process that just the process of just really peeling back things so that you can get to a place of more receptivity. And I wrote a note here for myself: how do cavemen think? Just wanted to tell a story of when I was younger. I actually, and I realized looking back on that now, in a way, it was like I was like training myself to be psychic. But I used to just think, like this was a recurring thought of mine. I would think, what was it that cavemen thought about? Like what, well, a time before language. So, and I don't necessarily believe that we have our whole human evolutionary timeline mapped out accurately, and I don't really believe that we know what it was like for people back in the days that we ascribe to caveman days. But the point being that in a time before language, what went on in people's heads? And it just fascinated me to think about that. And so I began a practice where I started practicing thinking without thoughts. And it just became a little game that I played. And I would have a thought about something that I was curious about, and I would stop myself and say, oh no, let's practice the non-thinking thing. And I would sit and I would try to find new ways to ponder it that didn't involve words. And that practice really opened me up to so much. And it's very, very Neptunian thing to do. And so I thought that that was a cool thing to pass on. I also think that that might help for others who are wanting to try to figure out how to do more of a Neptunian style of thinking without thoughts. That idea of thinking back to how did people think before we had language is kind of a cool practice, and it's fun. I suggest taking that on. So another way that the Piscean energies are mutually supported are reflected in the mutable cross, which holds a place of culmination. All the mutable signs have a culminating energy to them. And when I'm wanting to understand an archetype, I do want to look at it relative to the sign across from it and square to it. And sometimes, oftentimes, the signs next to it, there's a lot of value in seeing it in context to the bigger wheel, so to speak, because it's all connected. So the mutable cross includes Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. The mutable signs are each the final sign of each quadrant. And you can see here, I've mapped out the quadrants too. We have awareness of self, integration of self with environment, awareness of others, and integration of self with society. So as the soul is evolving from that original Aryan impulse to just push the will out into the environment all the way through to the completion of Pisces is a little bit of a journey that the soul goes on. And in each quadrant, they're picking up new levels of consciousness, so to speak. So the mutable energy of these signs reflect a level of comfort and mastery over the nature of each quadrant that they're in. Gemini finishes up the quadrant, which is about awareness of self, having developed the capacity to translate environmental inputs. Virgo finishes up the quadrant, which is about integration of self with environment. Having developed the ego through the prior signs, Virgo asks, but to what purpose or function? And begins fine-tuning. Sagittarius finishes up the quadrant that has to do with awareness of others, so connecting us to meaning beyond self-orientation. And finally, Pisces concludes the quadrant that is about integration of self with society. So having developed the individuated self in Aquarius, the soul is more comfortable with itself, and with less rigid parameters of self-definition, it is able to tune into and connect with a higher society of a cosmic order. So specifically, crosses made of squares and oppositions create tension. Regardless of how squares and oppositions are often talked about in astrology, tension does not have to be painful. And I get that astrology can be really helpful to understand why we're struggling with something. And we look at those squares and we know that, like, okay, this is applying the pressure and force for me to get real with something or to shift something. But the tension itself has a place, which doesn't have to have negative connotations. This tension, a relative amount, keeps the energies of the archetype in check. So shadow expressions do create further tension based on our karmas, but the tension in these cases serve to help resolve these shadows and bring the essence of the archetype into light. So when you are experiencing traumas around certain squares, those squares are really providing the right buffering that you need to work through some stuff, and a healthier, more liberated you is on the other side of that. So don't fight the squares. So Gemini and Sagittarius axis. The relevant tension that Gemini and Sagittarius provide to each other is more obvious, where together they help to ensure that you do not miss the trees for the forest or the forest for the trees. But Pisces helps to really elevate Gemini and Sagittarius such that you can better access bigger picture knowing and faith, which is represented in Sagittarius, by evolving the use of the mind in the ways we were previously speaking about. So moving from thinking to knowing, and knowing having more connection to Sagittarius. So connecting to a higher sensing. The more enlightened use of mind and knowing is achieved when the mind is used as an assistant. rather than the boss. So, so it takes notes, the mind, when you take it out of the position of being the boss and you just make it your assistant. It kind of just is able to like kind of take notes and jot stuff down for you when insight or some sort of knowing has arrived. The mind can say after the fact, okay, I understand. So you can still have a mind, like some kind of self-aware. It's the part of you that realizes that you just received some kind of insight, but it doesn't have to analyze it or pick it apart. It just, if as long as you're receiving, your mind doesn't jump into the driver's seat, then your mind can be really useful in that context. So Sagittarius keeps us connected to natural law. It is the divine natural order of which we are a part. Within the boundaryless nature of the Piscean archetype, we can at least still, through Sagittarius, connect to some cosmic order. So the fractaline aspect of nature which harmonizes, where it might otherwise feel as if we're floating in an abyss, in the great ocean. The Virgo-Pisces axis. Virgo and Pisces help each other tremendously. In Virgo, the shadow tendency to judge is dampened by Pisces' forgiving nature. It is hard to judge something while you are expressing unity consciousness. Feeling where you and the other are one helps you to have more compassion and trust in the other's own divine unfolding. Pisces and Virgo together also help you to key in on the energies of self and other, so that while you can hold your individuated self and therefore your individuated resonance as a soul, while also feeling the resonance of either another person or another type of energy that is differentiated from you, you can feel if the resonance is in harmony and aligned with you or if it is not. If it is not, there is no need to judge it as bad or wrong. The invitation is to learn to discern from what is aligned for you and what is not. For this, it is necessary to have a developed sense of individuated self so that you can have awareness of what is you and what is other, even while in a connected state. So it is discernment where this axis really shines, and which helps us to always make our choices in a way that allows us to live an aligned life and to not needlessly expend energies on that which is not. So again, just to clarify the point, whenever you are able to really inhabit your body, inhabit yourself, understand yourself as an individual, you can feel when something you come into contact with doesn't jive with that, doesn't resonate. With Virgo, one of the shadow sides of Virgo is a tendency to judge or cast out based on that, you know, from an ego perspective, centering self. It says, well, that person's not good enough for me, or, you know, not for me, and kind of sometimes in a casting out kind of way. When you are in the open place that Pisces really invites us into, that kind of more accepting place, it doesn't have to be that something that doesn't resonate for you is bad. It's just moving from judgment to discernment. So in that way, Pisces really elevates Virgo, and Virgo helps to keep Pisces' need for boundaries a little more in check. So for an example chart, I'm using myself as an example, since I'm able to speak on a very personal level about my experiences with this archetype and the ways in which it's impacted my life. My Neptunian signatures have been huge for me, and yet the hardest to grasp. But in recent months, they have been making a lot more sense with deep work of integration. And so I offer myself in a very personal and real way so that you can learn with me. And when I do these talks, whenever I dig into a topic, I end up learning a lot while I'm in the process of doing it, because for me, the act of writing brings further information and clarification. So one of the ways that I channel, and you can see I have my chart here. It's my Neptune is connected to my third house in Aquarius. Neptune is Sagittarius. And whenever I am writing, which is connected to my third house, oftentimes that Neptune Sagittarius combination really gets involved in what I'm doing on the page. And so, so I learn a lot by writing, and that's one of the reasons why I deliver these talks mostly written, is because whenever I go to write my notes, I'll just start writing until it's done. It'll just, the information that I'm wanting just it kind of just gives itself to me all at once. And so as I've written it, I trust the way that it comes through more than if I were in my head about it. And if I were to just give these talks by talking about this stuff, I don't think that I would be able to be as focused. So on that note, that's me getting into my chart for sure. But that's also me prefacing that I do want to speak about this in very personal terms, and trust that while I have pre-written all these personal things that I'm going to share, it is the most kind of direct way that I could share these things. So, so I'm going to do a bit of reading here. So Neptune, again, is in my first house. So it's bringing Neptune's nonlinear style to my house of initiation, which has a strong impact on my ability to focus my actions in linear ways, which is another reason why I really rely on writing. It can be hard for me to stay linear when I'm just sharing. In fact, oftentimes when I'm writing, I'll write things out of order and then have to go back and fix it and rearrange it. And I'm dyslexic too, so I'll literally write words backwards. So linearity is a big struggle for me. So in my life, I have a hard time beginning things because I have a hard time getting linear enough to reach a starting point. And just so it's clear, especially for those of you that are new to this, any planets that are in your first house have a strong presence in your life. You can't really get around it. They're going to be things that are very much in front of you at all times. So so that's Neptune in my first house is actually a really important signature for me. And I'll be honest, it took me quite a while to get around to this because, again, you know, it's kind of sometimes can be hard to get your head around Neptune. It can be a lot to unpack in a lot of ways that you can trip on your own ego or get mentalizing a little bit too much. So so I find that when I tune into what I want to do, I feel it as if it is one thing dumped on me at once. However, I do find that when I'm seeking to assess a situation to make a choice, I often get a quick snapshot from a higher platform where I'm able to see potential outcomes splitting off in all directions at once, and then choose accordingly in a way that avoids potential negative outcomes and steers toward desired ones. And so what this looks like is if I'm trying to make a plan for something, I will go through all the possible scenarios of, well, if I do this, that could branch off into these possibilities, and I follow those branches, which follow those branches, and something just kind of happens all pretty quickly. And then my response and what I come up with sometimes confuses my husband, who doesn't know how I got from point A to point B because there's so much in between. And when I'll lay it out for him, then it makes sense. So admittedly, this tendency has been most applied to a desire for controlling outcomes due to anxiety and mistrust in my environment. So this came about from a complicated childhood, which can be seen in my Pluto conjunct moon. And that's up there in my 10th and 11th house, my Pluto moon conjunction in Libra. So though there is a positive aspect between my Neptune and this conjunction, meaning that the skill has ultimately been a supportive skill, especially when not used for control. Though ultimately, as I grow into my soul's expression, it has become increasingly clear to me that this skill is to be surrendered out of respect for something much greater, which is faith. So throughout my life, seemingly at critical junctures, I have been asked to take many leaps of faith, often based on some feeling of divine inspiration. This comes from not just my Neptune guiding my actions, first house being your how you're action oriented. Um, so this comes not just from my Neptune guiding my actions, it also comes from the fact that it's in Sagittarius. Together, this signature helps me to key into some higher inspiration while connected to a harmonizing order, and one which I seek to be, quote, on the right side of. So it has never failed me, though it is hard to maintain this level of trust, no matter how many times it has been validated. Intuition knows so much more about what's possible than what is waiting, and what is waiting on the other side of a decision that the mind can come up with. But while the traumas associated with my Pluto continue to impact me, and realistically my nodes, which you might have noticed, my Neptune is very heavily tied into my karmic axis here, aspecting both Pluto and my nodes. And so while I continue to feel impacted from past traumas, I will continue to trip on myself on my journey of learning to surrender and to align myself with divine will. And ultimately, aligning my will with divine will is the essential ingredient to expressing my first house Neptune in its highest light. So again, this talk is called Making the Most of, and in a nutshell, if I say nothing else about my chart as an example, other than my Neptune is about me aligning my will with divine will, then enough has been said. So another way in which my Pluto and Moon and Neptune aspect influenced my childhood was through a tendency towards spiritual bypassing. So I talked about this a bit in the beginning, and this is something that has been plaguing me. Throughout my life, I thought of it. I think it's helped me. You know, when you grow up in trauma, our defense mechanisms can be really helpful up to a point, but I've definitely it's definitely limited me in a lot of ways, and it's been something that I've been working really hard to outgrow. So I would overlook cruelty in the name of love and acceptance and forgiveness for my abusers. So this was a saving grace in many ways in coping with a harsh childhood. But it also meant that I did not develop proper boundaries and had set into place for myself a clear pattern of letting myself be trampled in the name of acceptance with a total lack of boundaries. So I would identify with my abusers to the point that I would protect them from feeling any of my anger or sometimes disgust toward them, feelings that I never even allowed myself to acknowledge to even myself. Instead, moderating all of my thoughts for their, quote, spiritual worthiness. You can see this tendency in Neptune's aspect to my South Node in the third house in Aquarius. Even if I didn't have the same language to explain it back then, the tendency was firm. Neptune in this sense and in general is tied into my soul's well-developed past, being on connecting to my South Node. So this is why this tendency was so strong with me, even in my childhood, as well as the tendency to have felt plugged into something larger and some supportive presence which nurtured and guided me, which was a huge saving grace in my childhood. I always felt that connection, that I was loved, no matter how cruel the people around me were. And I grew up, I'll just, while we're getting personal, I grew up with Tourette's. So it wasn't the kind you see in the movies, which is about cussing. Tourette's is a combination of vocal tics and motor tics. For me, I had a lot of motor tics. I pulled my hair, a lot of eye rolling and rocking and wincing, and just a lot of just places where I twitched. And then my vocal tic was echolalia. And so I had a tic where I would have to feel my mouth saying the words that I was hearing. So, so needless to say, it didn't really set me up for a very easy upbringing in elementary school and middle school. There are lots of other things that I experienced outside of this. The Tourette's seem to have been, it can be something that's brought on, if you have the marker for it, it can be brought on due to other environmental stressors. But just to give you a little bit of a sense about what I was working with, having no friends, connecting to this sense of something bigger and loving was an absolute lifesaver. So this tendency towards spiritual bypassing, you can see is actually challenged by my Neptune square to my Sun and Jupiter on my midheaven in Virgo. And that's up in my 9th and 10th houses. The process of learning discernment, as encouraged by Virgo, has been a long process. My Sun and Jupiter challenged me to be clear on what it is that I stand for on a personal level, Sun, and in a larger context, Jupiter, so that I may not be distracted by being overly accommodating to others to the point of losing myself. And I'll say too, this being overly accommodating is very much also in my Pluto moon signature in Libra. So this feeling of, I have trauma, Pluto, around feeling that I'm responsible for everyone else's comforts, which makes it really hard for me to express my boundaries if I feel like that might interfere with someone else's comfort, and therefore lack of discernment. So Neptune in the first house, relative to my personal blocks, of course, also creates inertia in my house of action. Another effect of my spiritual bypassing is that when it comes to something I passionately want to do, yet haven't been able to overcome my inertia around, I catch myself saying, oh, I'll just get it in the next lifetime. And conversely, and in stark contrast to this, I struggle with the savior complex. The stellium on my midheaven, connected to my Neptune and Sagittarius in first, causes me to feel that I have some important actions or some important destiny. This feeling leaves me crippled under the weight and feeling of I have to get it right, or that my actions are too important to mess up. So Virgo Sun here thinks it has to be perfect, while Jupiter makes it feel too big. And being on the midheaven creates a feeling that I'm being watched. I've had to be careful to notice also where this tendency is in relationship to my ego, and more than anything, my ego in this context, or fear of ego, holds me down rather than propels me forward. So whereas there's, when I met with what I described in the beginning as this feeling of like grandiosity, that's a word, but just everything feeling too big or grandiose, my reaction to it isn't to say, oh, get out of my way, world, I'm special, I'm going to go do these things. My reaction to it is to want to hide and shut down. Ultimately, my the way that I've helped to reconcile that is when I do meet that feeling of bigness, it's been really helpful to learn astrology and to better understand that, like, there's just something about that signature in my first house creating such a strong impulse, and the way that that's met with all that activity on my midheaven, it creates the feeling of something being too big. It doesn't necessarily mean that I am meant to and have to fulfill some huge thing, even though it feels really big. So differentiating that has actually been a huge relief for me. Whereas someone else might feel like they really want to cling to this idea of like having some big special purpose. For me, letting go of that idea has been a critical piece in helping me to get back on my way. I'm still working my way out of a little bit of inertia, but it's getting past the grandiosity is a huge step for me. So this year, and specifically during the Neptune retrograde, has been deeply focused on undoing this complex and stepping way, way back in my practice and offerings so that I may actually focus on only doing what I can do without resistance. And whereas that feelings of grandiosity come in, that again is creating all the resistance, because then I feel like I can't do this, I can't do this. It feels like too much hanging on my head. And so my big work has been just to move out of resistance, and dropping that again has been critical to moving away from resistance. So addressing the process and whatever, sorry, so addressing in the process whatever traumas are creating this high level of tension in my soul's interpretation of these energies has also been critical. And that's been, as I've been letting go of doing anything that I have resistance to, it's helping me slowly start to come into contact with some of these traumas. I'm helping, instead of just trying to push past it and just force myself, I'm slowing down, and I'm really doing the work now to feel into that resistance and where it's coming from. So the solutions I've been working on have been manyfold. One, I was blessed with the breakthrough that it is not my job to save anyone, only to love and support them in any way that I can, while trusting that they can save themselves. Neptune, just to clarify, Neptune is trining my North Node in Leo in the 9th house. Leo is the heart, Leo is love. So simply, my job is to teach through love. 9th house being teaching in a way, like a form of higher education, and Leo being love. So also, when I'm moving away from resistance, I find that when I do only what I can do with that resistance, that is only doing what I can do with love, my energy naturally goes toward art and music. So Neptune trying North Node in Leo again. Leo having to do with creative expression. 2, I've come to terms with some unhelpful trauma-informed conditioning that my actions don't have value unless they positively impact others, or that I don't have values unless I'm of use to others. 3, I've learned that what I do is much less important than the energetic quality of what I offer, by only doing what I can do with love. 4, I learned that the solution for me is to not focus on the specific container, protocol, or steps in the way that I feel Virgo wanting me to. The times when I feel an open channel with spirit and guidance comes with ease, my Virgo Sun conjunction Jupiter, conjunct Jupiter, kicks in and says, oh crap, you have to use this window to ask all of your questions and try to learn as many of the secrets of the universe as possible. And if I don't write it all down afterward in the perfect way, then I'll lose it all and I'll fail at life. So a lot of pressure. Spirit has been telling me instead that my job is simply to cultivate and strengthen this channel so that I can rely on it being there as needed, and by having faith. So I have to have faith in the information's ability to be there when needed. So it's my relationship to this channel that will facilitate my work, no matter what form it takes at any given moment. It means a letting go of grasping for answers and meaning. To be a channel means to be okay with having your hands empty. So I wanted to, I put a bunch of asterisks there because I wanted to remind myself to explain what I mean by, explain to what I mean by having my hands empty. I had a really powerful lesson happen about a year ago for me, when I woke up in the morning just feeling like in this wildly open space. I was needing to drive to a class, and it was almost like I couldn't drive. I was just feeling so open and just light. Also, I got there safely. And when I came into the classroom, and seeing all these faces of people that I love and had been really enjoying this class with, I just found that I couldn't bring myself to speak to anyone. I was in such a different space, and finally I realized I needed to go and sit down and be with whatever this was. Like there was some huge peace landing, some kind of upgrade, you could say. And when I sat and asked what it was, I was told that there was, in fact, some shifting on a DNA level, some kind of upgrade happening. And when I asked what that was, Spirit told me that it was to see things as they are. And I became overwhelmed by the idea of that, and instantly started dismissing it, saying, oh, well, I can't, I can't possibly see enough. There's just too much. There's too much. And I have a better idea now and what it meant by that. At the time, I just went to something even bigger. It felt like I couldn't really manage to integrate. And to calm me down, Spirit explained to me that I was grasping in that moment. I was trying too hard to understand it, and that I was grasping for it, and that if I wanted to receive it, I needed to let go. And it gave me an image of something coming to me and me putting my hands out to hold it. Oh, that's right. There was another piece in here. So it showed me putting my hands out to hold it, and that I was already clinging. I was already clinging to something else, and that was what I think I know. And it told me for me to see things as they are, I have to let go of how I'm seeing them already, and that my hands are already full with all of the things that I think I know. And it told me I have to put that down, that I can't catch something new if my hands are already full. I have nothing to hold it with. Um, then so it helped me to envision like just letting it go, putting my hands down. And then the next piece was, as it was still continuing to come in and land, I was told, now the trick is don't grasp for the new information, that as soon as you try to grab onto it, your hands are going to be full again. And the only way that you can truly be a channel is to allow and trust for your hands to be empty at all times, to allow yourself to not be grasping to or clinging to or holding on to anything at all. And so that has been a bit of a trip, and it's been helpful and an impetus for me in a lot of other ways. I have to return back to this lesson often, because this is not something that I've been able to instantly master, but the integration is one of these examples where like the integration is going to take years, but it's just a matter of trusting the wisdom in that, and trusting in myself to eventually get there. And I offer all of these things in the hopes that they will be of value to you also, the listener. Is really my hope in doing this, not to, the focus for me isn't to talk about myself. The focus for me is to share so much of what I've learned and the things that apply universally, about the archetypes that are, that my story in some ways, our stories are unique, but in so many ways, I feel like my story really isn't unique. That this is just, the information is not meant just for me personally, and that the expression of these archetypes are meant to be available to everyone. And so to look at how that is presenting itself in an individual chart, will be for you or a trusted astrologer to determine together. But as an example, my chart has given me so many opportunities to work with this archetype. And so it's been helpful for me to really give this the proper focus. So another big piece of my chart, and relative to the Pisces Neptune archetype, is obviously my my Uranus square the nodes in my 12th house. So I've talked a lot so far about Neptune in my first house. And for those of you studying specifically EA, have probably been saying this whole time, like, wait a minute, what about that Uranus square the nodes in the 12th house? Like, that's a big deal. So, and I've had a lot more practice in working with that signature. This talk has been helping me, writing this talk is helping me to get more clear on integrating the lessons from my Neptune first house. But what I can say about my Uranus in the 12th house is that this Uranus skip step in EA, when you have a planet square the nodes, it's creating certain amount of challenge to your nodal axis, because there's at some point you got started on the work of the North Node. As a soul, you started moving toward the direction of your North Node, but you left some things incomplete, so to speak, some things that really need to be brought up to speed. So in this case, That's the case for me with Uranus, also Chiron in the 6th house, which is opposing at Uranus. So those two signatures are heavily impacting my chart. So this Uranus skip step is integrated through my North node. If you want to know which node to apply that signature to, like how to really integrate what needs to be done around that, something that happens with skip steps is you get torn, like kind of ping-ponging between the north and south node. You experience, like, for example, I would experience that Uranus in a very Leonian way sometimes, or in a very Aquarian way other times. And those two ways of expressing it sometimes run counter to each other. And so I have to figure out where do I focus this energy. So if you were to think of your chart as this two-dimensional thing that you're standing on from the outside looking in toward the center, standing at the position of that planet, which is your skip step, you want to look to whatever node is on your left, and that's the node that you integrate that into. So so this Uranus skip step is integrated through my north node, yet it's the ruler of my south node. So it brings my north and south node together in very meaningful ways. It challenges me to get out of my head and getting too bogged down with all of the overthinking or management of every possible detail of what could go wrong or right in a situation. To stop overthinking my worthiness to help others, and to instead focus on allowing my individuated self, Uranus, to do what it needs to do without having to explain myself or placate others. So integrating it into my Leo North node means prioritizing my own self-expression in this way, and allowing my actions, above all else, to feel authentic to me and not contrived. So no going through the motions, because I'm the tendency, again, from that Pluto Moon conjunction, Pluto in the 11th house too, which is really in Libra, you know, really again challenging me to really express myself as an individuated soul, to have better boundaries. Pluto Moon in Libra, trauma around feeling like I'm too responsible for the feelings of everyone around me at a young age, that I have to put people at ease. That's something that I've carried my whole life, that I'm always disarming. So I'll step into a little bit of a role for people, and to shake that is really imperative, that I am able to really get to work in a way that is much more authentic to me and do that North node. Leo is about like allowing yourself to actually really center yourself in your experience. So an enormous piece of healing lately has come from doing away with the, quote, thought moderation that I was talking about earlier. So in connection to the South Node is where I've been always like kind of catching my thoughts and measuring them against some spiritual worthiness, and having all these filters up and controlling my thinking. When I don't temper my thoughts, when I'm angry, I can feel things that my heart, and again, like heart being Leo, I can feel things that my heart was storing and not processing through. It doesn't mean that I give into negative thinking or even ultimately identify with the thoughts, as I still, even while I'm allowing my thoughts to come through unfiltered, I still don't disconnect from the reverence and acceptance that I hold for life and those in it. I can even feel that the thoughts aren't ultimately resonant for me. But by not repressing them, I allow my heart to purge, so that it doesn't create bitterness inside, by not tending to the feelings that I'm ultimately able to reach when allowing my thoughts to flow through unimpeded. It also gets me much, much more in touch with my needs. When I'm constantly filtering and moderating and being for people and being affable, my priorities have been kind of oriented in such a way it doesn't really leave room for me, and doesn't leave room for me to have needs. And so allowing myself to stop filtering, at least for my own self, my own thoughts, you know, for God's sake, allowing myself to just not filter that. It might be that I do a purge, and then on the other end of it, I say, oh, okay, I'm needing some stuff here, and I can tend to that much more consciously. So this Uranus square is also positively aspected to my Sun and Jupiter midheaven stellium, so that it's clear that integrating this Uranus fully into my chart is the needed solution to overcoming the inertia of my first house, Neptune. By valuing my individuated impulse to do what is in support of my deeper yearnings and desires, Uranus and Scorpio, the stellium on my midheaven will more naturally be supported as I no longer hold myself back. So that's my chart. I could talk more, but I wanted to keep this talk around an hour, so I think we're just about there. Thank you so much. Sorry I couldn't do any volunteers this time. This is my first pre-recorded talk, so maybe in the future I'll open up again more to volunteers. You can also reach out to me, prism-dawn.com, for if you have like any additional questions. It feels a little awkward to not leave room for questions, but if you have questions or if you just want to chat, definitely please connect. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Neptune, and thank you, Linda, and the Zoom team, and the EA Zoom meetings team, and all of the really amazing work that you guys put in.